Welcome to Sincerely Me, a podcast about self-discovery and inner work so you can cultivate a deeper relationship to yourself and show up more fully in your work and life. My name is Tallia and I'm honored to be your host. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I wanted to take a quick moment here before I introduce today's guest and get going with the episode to send a big thank you to Allie. Allie, I know you're listening, and I just wanted to take this chance. I know I say thank you probably once a day, but I needed to take another opportunity here to just tell you how easy you make life for me and how much I appreciate everything that you do. Thank you. So today's episode is with Julianne Vaccaro. Julianne is a somatic sexologist, and if you don't know what that means, don't worry. We have a whole episode about it. And she helps powerful women self-heal and come back home to their bodies for a life of freedom and pleasure. If you don't follow Julianne on Instagram, you are missing out. She is so much fun. She has such great content, and she's also a podcast host of a podcast called the Reclamation Project podcast, and I had the honor of being a guest on her podcast. I'll link the episode in the show notes for you all to listen to that as well. She led such an awesome conversation, and I had such a great time being a guest. So thank you, Julianne, for having me on your amazing podcast as well. So in this episode, there's a lot. We get into so many good stuff. So really it's about ego, as you know from the title of this episode, and it's about understanding and being able to distinguish between your ego and the part of you that's actually authentic and real. We talk a lot about how to use your ego as something that can be in service of your authentic self. We talk about why change can be hard. We talk about all the illusions that ego kind of hides beneath. We talk about somatic work, the work that Julianne does, and how the emotional and spiritual stuff manifests in our physical bodies. We talk about self-trust and learning to reconnect with your intuition. Like I said, we get into a lot of good stuff, but really it's again about really understanding what the ego is and how to work with the ego and how to separate the ego-based, fear-based part of you from the part of you that is authentic and real and true. If this episode title and topic resonates with you, if you feel called to explore your authentic self, to reconnect to those parts of you that are true, and to kind of sort through those ego-based parts of you, I would invite you to look into joining us in October in Bali. I am co-hosting a 5-day retreat with Deborah and Quabell, and the two of us are creating a very rich experience that will support you in turning inward, in cultivating a deeper relationship to yourself, in honoring that call within you that's asking for your attention, and following the curiosity, following your spiritual curiosity, following your bliss, following those inner pings that you might be ignoring, that are asking for some attention, for some time and space to look at your life, to look at your work, to look at the way you're showing up, and to honor, to listen, to cleanse, to release, to allow, to give permission to the parts of you that really want to be revealed and to be shown in the world. So details for the upcoming Bali retreat are all linked in the show notes. And that's all I got for you guys. I want to go ahead and share this episode with you and get into this conversation with Julianne. So without further ado, I don't know why I say that. I don't even know what it means. But anyways, here is my conversation with Julianne. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Julianne. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tallia. So delighted to be here.
I could not be more thrilled to jump into the topics that we've set out to discuss today. Your work out in the world is so powerful, so moving, and I was like in such a rabbit hole looking at all of your content and looking into the programs and the work you're doing. And after looking through it all, I felt like the best place for us to start is really a kind of big idea, but I would love for us to discuss over the next however many minutes it takes us, if not the full hour, the role of ego and the battle that we all inevitably face between our ego and our truest, most authentic selves. I know both of us in different ways do work to support people through that battle, to heal the wounds that come up in the battle or from the battle. So I'd love to just start with understanding what the ego is and the gap that exists between our ego selves, minds, and our truest, kind of most authentic parts of who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this conversation. So I think the first thing that I really want to start with is Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Voice of Knowledge. I read that a couple of months ago, and I felt like the description and kind of like journey that we go on as humans was just very easily depicted in that book. And so he kind of talks about, with like all religion aside, really just talking about like Adam and Eve and how we ate the apple from this tree, which then introduced this voice of knowledge, which ideally is the ego. And so this voice of knowledge in our head can very easily create story and create all of these different ideas, and has a lot to say, like has a lot to say all of the time. So that would be the ego. And we can get more specific around what ways the ego, how you can kind of recognize the ego inside of yourself and what it sounds like, and how the voice sounds. But ideally, the ego and the authentic self really feels a whole lot different in yourself. So, for example, the ego loves to really identify with three main patterns: the illusion of comfort, the illusion of security, and or control. So those three things are really what the ego loves to cling on to. So kind of like the validation externally, or the idea of of having security, whether it be from a partner, a job, or something like tangible like that, or control. So trying to kind of control everything and really remain in that seat of power, when in reality we don't. We have intentions and we do create a reality, but at the end of the day, we don't really call all of the shots, right? So that's what the ego loves to kind of control. And then the authentic self is really more of your higher self. It's where that direct knowing comes from. It's what I would say the connection to sources, whatever you believe to be a higher power, if it's spirit, God, whatever resonates most with you. And so your authentic self is really the voice of truth, and there's no duality with your authentic self. It's just love, and kind of like what is, and just that connection to love, like capital love, the frequency of it, and everything that's kind of come from that place of creation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of like your authentic self is where the duality no longer exists. I think what I see a lot in my coaching work with people is exactly that, is duality, is this right, wrong, either or, good, bad, success, failure, and this just way of thinking that keeps us very almost like linear in this like one dimensional way of thinking that's so not expansive in the way our truest, highest selves are really capable of thinking, feeling, and experiencing.
Completely. Yeah, so much. And I think that in that place where there is so much duality, that's where so much of our confusion comes in. That's where our pain, our suffering, the noise of our mind gets created. And that's like the rabbit hole that we can so easily spiral down with when we're trying to kind of like cling to, like you said, what is right or wrong? Or is this the right decision? Is this good? Is this bad? And really all of that is a source of judgment, and kind of like really trying. What I always love to say is like the ego loves to classify things. It loves to put things in a box. So if you're operating from that place of ego, and you're having that ego reference thinking, let's say, just say you walk into a party and you see someone there, you instantly start to kind of judge them and categorize them, like, what are they? What box do they fit in? And where can I place them? Are they above me? Are they below me? And really put
Mhm.
them in some kind of spot and judge and bring them into that place of judgment. Whereas if you were coming in from your authentic self, really observing and coming in with that energy of love and accepting who they are and what they are, and knowing that there is no levels that exist in that way.
Mhm. Yeah, and something that just came up for me as you were talking is how in many ways I think of ego as it's different than fear, but in many ways they're very much connected.
Completely.
And I a lot of what I encourage people to do is to think about fear as something to work with instead of something to completely eliminate or something that we tend to work against. And I think for many people too in the conversations around ego, it's not that well, this is an opinion. I guess I want your perspective on this. Like ego, is it something that we're trying to like overcome, overpower, or is it something that you think is the goal to work with it in the same way as fear, or is the goal um to no longer have ego? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is such an important question. Well, I love that you said that it can be the source of fear, which often it is. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that ego gets a really bad rap. Like, oh, your ego is activated. You're getting triggered because your ego. You're saying that because of your ego. And yeah, ego can absolutely have a lot of it can bring a lot of suffering into us. It can bring a lot of judgment and create these negative, uncomfortable experiences, both for ourselves and others. But there's also a beauty that comes with ego. And without our egos, we wouldn't be here. So I think that it's more around what fuels our ego. And what I always like to say is really allowing your authentic self to fuel your ego and to kind of
Mhm.
guide your ego to create whatever you're wanting to create. Because without that, without that drive, without the ego, you wouldn't be climbing up the ladder to where you want to be. You wouldn't be able to have that healthy competition. But it's about that balance between the two, and always coming from that place of love and compassion and understanding and empathy and all of those that really belong to the authentic self. But again, using that to fuel the ego. Is that
Yes.
yeah?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it's funny you said that because the first thing I wrote down as before I asked you the question was um, instead of working against the ego or resisting the ego, it's about learning to use the ego as something that's in service of the self, the
Mhm.
authentic self, the truest self. And yeah, and I think the resistance to whether it's fear, ego, the pain, the suffering, that's where we just add to the pain. We're not doing anybody any favors by resisting the things that are painful. I think it's opportunities for us to look at what's actually going on and the patterns, our ego patterns that actually need to be healed. And I think and I'll speak for myself, like when I'm confronted with pain or struggle or challenge, the ego immediately goes to why is this happening? Who can I blame? Why is this like it's the victim mentality? It's the um, life is hard and I don't deserve to feel good mentality. And I think when we're able to step out of that and recognize that our ego, our mind, the monkey brain, the thoughts, the fear, that's not who we are, and to create a detachment from that and to separate ourselves from that, I think is one of the most important steps we can take. But sometimes we don't recognize that it's not us, you know?
Yeah, I think it can be a challenge to recognize, and it can feel all consuming so much that we like don't even feel like we can get out of it. And I think something that you said before too, with the in terms of the fear, is like you said, it's not just like the ego. Those emotions aren't bad. Like none of those emotions, any of the constrictive emotions like fear, anger, sadness, sorrow, grief, like those are not bad. Those are an invitation to something greater, to an opportunity of deeper self-understanding, growth, and expansion. And also I feel like those are, without the dark there is no light. And so often we want to feel all of the joy and all of the expansion, yet we shun these other emotions that are on the other side of the spectrum. But in order to be full spectrum, we need to feel that full range. And so like you said, the ego isn't bad, the fear isn't bad, but it's about learning how to work with the two of them to your highest evolution and purpose here, because that is the way through, that is the way to your higher self, to your greater vision. And I think that, well, I know that it never goes away, right? Like the ego is never going to go away. That voice is never going to go away. It can absolutely get quieter, and it can shift the way that it speaks. You can shift the way that it that you relate to that. And I think that you can hear the voice change the more that you really do the work around it. But it doesn't ever go away. And so I think that we need to shatter that expectation of like, when is this ever going to stop? It doesn't. So we need to kind of know that we're going to have to learn to work with it. And it's not a bad thing, but what does our voice sound like? What are our fears? And what are the tools and the practices and the processes that we know we need in order to alleviate the patterns of the ego, or those three kind of ego patterns, like I said, comfort, security, control. What works for us, and how can we take back our alignment and come back into our authentic self, or even in that neutral observation mode, like you were saying, rather than being so much in it, recognizing that it's not us. And I think that's one of the most like healing realizations or awarenesses that we can do, is that we are not our behavior, and we are not these things. Yes, they might be something that we've done and we've participated in, but there is this space between those things and who we truly are at the essence of our being.
Yeah, and that's such a good segue into the topic of change, because I think when we think about change, it's important to remember what you just said, which is that we are not our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors. And I think it was Dr. Joe Dispenza. I heard him speak at the Attune conference here in Atlanta just a few weeks ago. And he said that change is nothing but being greater than the behavior, being greater than the program, being greater than the pattern, being greater than your body that's gotten used to the comfort, the security, the control. And to recognize that, again, you are not the things you do. You have so much more power over these things than you think. It's been such a helpful tool for me, at least in the simplest ways. Like if I'm catching myself in a pattern or a habit, whether it's behavioral or emotional, I'll literally stop and tell myself, Tallia, like, be greater than the program, be greater than the pattern. You have so much more control here than you think you do. And it's been so powerful in those moments in real time to stop myself and create space for change to occur, because I recognize what's me and what's just been programmed habitually.
Yeah, I love that process too, of just really reminding yourself that you have the power, and that you are kind of in control. I know there's almost like an oxymoron here.
Yeah, yeah.
We have the ability to step outside of it, but how often are we just going into the pattern because it is our natural way of allowing that to happen? Like, we have neural nets that form from doing the same thing over and over. So if that pattern arises and maybe we're not slowing down enough to kind of look at that and make a different choice, then it's going to be really automatic. And so it can feel so heavy and feel like we're never going to get out of it, when really we do have the power to do so.
Yeah, and it starts with just making the decision to commit to the change.
Completely.
Yeah.
And I think that the expectation trap is huge as well. And that's another piece of the ego that keeps us in that cycle and in that pattern of, well, I'm here now, this is where I want to be. And these smaller steps feel useless. They don't feel like they're going to get me anywhere. And so I might as well just stay over here in this side. When really all of those little changes make such a big difference, and they all add up. But I'm sure we might get to this, but the ego wants to keep you safe and wants to keep you protected. And so because of that, often the change can feel really scary, and it can feel like we're stepping out into an open field and being really vulnerable. And in some situations we might be, but who's to say that's good or bad or right or wrong?
Yeah. And I love that idea because I think that also becomes such a great way to check yourself in real time in the moment when you're trying to make a decision, you're faced with choices, to come back to yourself and ask yourself, is option A or option B going to be the thing that, like, is it going to strengthen the ego? Is it going to feed the ego, or is it going to help me regain kind of authentic power and control? Again, is, I think, it's a tricky word to be using because to your point, there's like the ego wants control, but you can also take back control. So that's a separate conversation. But
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're faced with choices, is the choice that you feel tempted, or that your tendency to make a certain choice, is it in service of the ego, or is it in service of the self? Where is it coming from? Which part of you is it serving, strengthening, giving more power to? And is it conscious? I think just bringing it to the consciousness, being aware of it, helps with making the decision a little bit more intentional.
Yeah, completely. And I feel like this may be a good opportunity to kind of share just some examples of how you can recognize the difference between ego and authentic self. Is that okay?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, because I feel like sometimes that can feel like the most confusing part. I mean, I get questions all the time of how can I connect to my intuition? How can I strengthen it? How can I tell the difference between my intuition and my fear? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
that can be a really big challenge of if I'm making this decision, or I often hear, there's this new guy in my life or new woman, and I feel a lot of fear and I can't tell if it's intuition or I can't tell if it's like my body's way of saying no. Some ways you can tell if your ego is really present and prominent in your thought processes, like we said initially, if there's any engaging in right versus wrong thinking, like is it trying to
Mm-hmm.
classify right or wrong or good versus bad? If we're blaming others, as you mentioned, like if we're in victimhood and really telling our story in that way, if we're really attached to those three illusions of the ego: comfort, security, control, if we're reactive, negative, projecting judgments of ourselves, of others, of situations, let anything around projection. So kind of projecting the way someone else might be doing something or feeling. And then lastly, really looking at our internal self-talk. And I think this is really one of the biggest ones where the ego can continuously prove those illusions of unworthiness or not enoughness. And so that self talk that really strengthens that belief, which is not our truth.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for so many of us, it's not until we slow down to even pay attention to what, it's like, what are the thoughts your mind is coming up with? What are the habits? What are the patterns? We get so caught up in, and I feel like a broken record because I probably say this on literally every episode of my podcast, but when you get so caught up in the speed, we're not even seeing what's happening, and we're experiencing, the pain, the headache, it shows up in symptomatic ways that we might not even connect to, we might not even know to, like, connect to the cause, right? So I think to have that space to just pay attention, to not judge, to not try to fix it necessarily, but to just look and see what is going on, what is the way I'm showing up, where is it coming from, how is it serving me, and where is there room to make some change if need be.
Yeah. And I think I'm definitely a firm believer, especially with the somatic work that I do and I've experienced personally with clients, is that so much of what is happening on a spiritual and emotional level shows up in our body and manifests in our physical body. And we have all these aches and these pains and these symptoms and ailments and all of these things. And while sometimes they're physical and we do need these things, I really feel like I'm such a firm believer in that all of these symptoms that we feel on a physical level are from unhealed memories and traumas that we've just not looked at, and they've collected over and over, and it's stuck energy in the body. And we can cure and heal so much of that by looking at our by looking at what's happening emotionally, internally, and really looking at the things that we don't want to look at, the shadow work and all of that. And then just to further that conversation of kind of being able to tell the difference between and authentic self, some ways you can identify if your authentic self is coming through is by stepping into that place of acceptance, accepting what is, accepting personal responsibility around our internal world. So really owning our thoughts and our feelings rather than blaming it on somebody else, and owning our experience. Remaining neutral. So I've said before, neutral observation. So being in that place of neutrality with ourselves, with others. And our authentic self is really linked to our creative self. It is that place of creation. So creativity is a source of our authentic self, and anything that's supporting who we truly are at that core level, that core essence, a divine being having a human experience, and really having thought patterns and self-talk that supports the inherent worthiness that we do have.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all super helpful. I think what I come back to, and this, I think it definitely takes practice, to what you said before we hit record, is like, it's a muscle, learning to trust yourself, learning to decipher between ego self, authentic self. You got to train that muscle, right? Like it's if you haven't been paying attention to the patterns and who's showing up, what part of you needs attention, it's going to take time and practice. And one of the practices I've been turning back to is just a simple question of of going to the thought or going to the action or whatever it is that I feel like I want to embody or express, and to ask myself, does it feel light or does it feel heavy? And just that one question, it it gives me, it's like the nudge that I need to either move forward or to take a step back and continue to pause and be more conscious about what I'm about to do. There's that. And there's also, does this feel expansive? Does it feel like it's going to help me stand taller and, with my shoulders back? Or does it feel like it's going to contribute to my ongoing smallness, and is it going to keep me contracted, or is it going to, build me up and help me breathe more easily? And again, it's a lot easier said than done, and it's a continual practice for me, but that's an easy kind of thing to turn to in moments of decisions or choices, where I can look at, the lightness, the heaviness, the expansiveness, the contraction. Where does it feel like it's sitting in my body? And learning to trust that and tune into that has been really helpful.
Yeah, completely. And I love the piece of, because it is a muscle, and I feel that this work can sometimes it takes a lot to kind of jump into this work initially. And then once we start walking, it gets easier, and maybe not easier, but more clear, and we can really tune into ourselves deeper.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the piece with self-trust can bring up a lot of fear and insecurity and doubt, because we're taught so often to look outside of ourselves for the answers. And maybe we've done things in our past, or we've had these mistakes, or whatever it is that we've just blamed ourselves for, right? Like the ego will come in and it's our fault, and maybe we could have done better. And so there's all this judgment and guilt and shame, which I feel then lessens our self-trust. So then when we go to actually build that muscle and connect with our intuition, it feels like, well, maybe I wasn't able to trust myself in the past, or in the past it led me down these really dark paths. And so what I feel like, if anybody listening is resonating with that, because I know I definitely struggled a lot with that myself, I feel that because we've kind of been taught so much to look for the answers externally, we've often ignored our direct knowing and our intuition. Mm-hmm. And so that also creates that lack of self-trust, because, well, maybe we did have that intuitive nudge and we went the other direction. And so that reinforces it. So I think that for anyone listening who's really trying to step into that or build that self-trust muscle, to really remember that it is a muscle, and that you've always had that there. And it's really about giving yourself the opportunity to trust yourself and to develop that, and to know that maybe there's going to be the bumps and things like that. But at the end of the day, you always have you, and those bumps and those obstacles and struggles that come through, again, are not right or wrong or good or bad. And they're put there to even more strengthen your self-trust. And they're part of that process and journey. But it's so important to stay on that path and to know where you're going, to know that those obstacles are, again, not a deterrent, but they're a strengthener.
Yeah. And I think going back to the idea of duality, you know, I think in the moments of being afraid of making the choice or judging whatever might happen as a consequence of that choice, I think coming back to the possibility that there is no right or wrong can be so incredibly freeing. And I think I've said this on the podcast before at some point, but I heard someone recently share this idea that there is no such thing as a right or wrong decision. It's about making a decision, whatever feels the best to you in the moment, and then making it right after the fact. And yeah, I think this idea of there not being duality when you're coming from your authentic self is very similar to this idea, right? That like there's there what if there wasn't a right or wrong? What if you just made a choice and then saw what happened, which can be extremely terrifying for a lot of people, but something I've also been trying to practice recently, honestly in the past like week or two, has been when I'm trying to, and it could be as like a decision as silly as what I'm ordering at a restaurant, but to not let myself take too much time to consider options, but to go with what I know I'm going to end up with anyways, right? Like we
Yeah.
spend so much, my husband, like every time I get dressed in the morning to go out or whatever, I try on like 10 outfits and I always end up wearing the first one. Right. And he's like, what is all this time you're spending when you know what you want? And it's just, it shows up in so many small ways. But one thing I'm trying to do now is to not let myself consider other options and just trust that my first instinct is what's right for me in the moment.
Yeah. And I think that's such a beautiful example, because how many of us do that? I mean, it's an easy example, because it's like, okay, we have that intuitive pull, we make the decision, and then the thought starts to come in, and we start to second guess everything. And
Yeah.
there's a quote, I think it's there's no such thing as right or wrong, thinking makes it so.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as that starts to come in, that's when all the second guessing starts. And I made a graphic the other day for Instagram talking about neutral observation, where there was like a silhouette of a person with a circle around it. And that being the example of us really in the story, like completely consumed with all of the thoughts and all the stories and everything that the ego is talking. And then when we're being that neutral observer and really just looking at the situation, it's the silhouette just looking at this circle and looking at the scenario and not really attaching any charge, and observing the thoughts that are coming through. And like you said, with the fear, using that as an invitation to go inward and to say, okay, what is the fear?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between hearing and listening. We can hear the ego, we can hear the stories, we don't need to listen to them. And that's that piece of neutral observation and really staying in our power.
Yeah.
As our self.
I'm curious for you, when, and maybe you can speak from like a past perspective or currently, when or how does ego show up for you most often?
I think I'm going to go with the past. So I think that the somatic work for me has absolutely been the most transformative, because it felt like it's completely taken me out of my head and straight down into my body. And so honestly, I've almost struggled a little bit on my social platforms since doing so much of this work, because I built so much of my business on sharing my personal experience and sharing my stories, which are all stories. And so now I've noticed that every time I go to talk on my story or share a podcast, it's almost like there's a resistance to going into the story, because I see it and I'm like, well, no, I'm going to hang out over here in neutral observation land. Like, those aren't the truths.
Yeah.
So I think that the question was, when does my ego come out most and how do I kind of respond?
Yeah.
I think that now I've strengthened the muscle so much that I can really see when it's coming out. And don't get me wrong, it definitely can come out and maybe me not catch it initially. But when I feel any of those things that I shared earlier of the ego reference thinking, like reactivity or negativity, I instantly go into neutral observation and can really see what's happening and what the stories are,
Mm-hmm.
and remain in that place of neutrality. And whether it be expressing how I feel, whether it be with myself or with my partner or with others, but just really giving voice to it and hearing what it has to say, and bringing love and compassion into those parts. So if it's an insecurity, allowing that to come out and really going deeper into it. So for me, I have really in the past struggled so much with body image. I started out in the health and fitness industry and went to school to be a holistic health coach, and then did yoga and boxing and bodybuilding for about 4 years. And so I developed a really unhealthy relationship with myself and my body, which all really stemmed from unworthiness and not enoughness. And so it was always this chase for perfection where everything that I did was striving for that image, and it was just never enough. So if any of those insecurities come through now, or any of those challenges or struggles or stories or those constrictive emotions, I heard someone say it once, probably when I first started getting into the personal development industry, but like, look forward to the challenge. Like, I feel that so much in myself now, where if it ever comes up, I'm like, ooh, good. Like, next part of the evolution, like, what's the next thing that's going to come up? Because it just, it doesn't feel like there's that charge of identity of who I am anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than stuff coming up and me going into, well, I'm not worthy and this must mean I'm not enough and I'm not XYZ, it's more of a, well, that's so silly. And like, what do I really need in this moment to bring myself back into my power? And a strategy that I always love to use with my clients and with myself is, and with my partner, is always like, the voice says, and using that sentence stem. So when you actually are going into that story, or the ego is really loud, using the sentence stem, the voice says, can so much create the space between you and then whatever story is present. So for example, the voice says that I've been sick all week and I haven't been able to go to the gym, and my body is going to do this, which means you're not going to love me and I'm not going to be enough, and blah, blah, blah. And when you can say that out loud and really use that sentence, then again, it creates that distance. And often when we say it out loud and we use that, it's no longer a part of us. It's no longer a part of who we are. There's that distance. And then it kind of often just sounds silly when we say it out loud. And it's like, well, I know that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Love that strategy and technique, and I use that all the time.
Yeah, I love that. One thing that I sounds similar as a practice is the question of, what do I know to be true right now, when you're catching yourself getting caught up in the story, in the, again, monkey brain, the thoughts, the fears, the ego. What do I know to be true right now? It's an immediate, like, really grounding practice. Like, it literally brings you from your head into your body, and brings you back to what it is that you know. And when we get caught up in the hurricane of those stories, it feels, at least for me, it's like my feet aren't on the ground anymore. And it's literally about putting my feet back onto the earth and being like, I am here. Here's what I know. I am safe. Here is what is true. Here is all that is right now. And it removes some of the chaos, uncertainty, whatever it is that's being made up. It completely takes you out of that and puts you into the present, which I think is the purpose and the goal of all of this work, is to be right where you are, to embrace what is, and to fully experience the moment that you're in.
Completely. And I think, you said the word safety, and I think that's so important, because I feel that when the ego does act up, it is coming from that place of protection and wanting to keep you safe and keep you protected. And so we develop these adaptations and coping mechanisms to keep us safe. And
Mm-hmm.
if we can just remind ourselves in those moments of constriction that we are safe and that it is okay, and create the distance from ourselves and the conflict, we
Mm-hmm.
then can take a second to breathe into it and to know that we do have the power to respond in a way without that reactivity.
Yeah, absolutely. What is kind of a part two to my first question, but what is the are you currently working through any lessons? Is your ego being faced with any lessons right now that you're feeling particularly challenged by?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that I feel it kind of showing up in two ways right now, I could say. And I think that to go back to your last question, too, what I've learned to do with myself that's been really helpful is that when I am not 100% clear, to just be still and to not necessarily, well, to not really kind of take any action yet, and to really find that clarity and to sit in the stillness with it.
Mm.
So I think right now where my ego is showing up most, and again, it's just so interesting from like where I sit now to where I was, because it would have been such a different process. And so it's almost like when I speak on it, I'm like, well, I don't want to put words to it. But it's like in my business, I feel that I'm at this next like growth edge. And something that you said before also reminded me of it, where we can fight and fight and fight against our purpose, or our, I forgot what words you used, but like our true essence and who we are and our purpose and everything like that. But at the end of the day, like that's going to always be within us. And so with this growth edge in my business, I've always felt this drive to be as big as I can in my purpose and in this personal development space and whatnot. And it's and wanting significance and wanting notoriety, and never really having previously having shame around it, but now fully owning and accepting that, and feeling like that it in itself is part of the purpose, like being in front of the masses and on stages and all of these things. And so I think that it's bringing up a lot of just unknown, and not even feelings of unworthiness or not enoughness, but just like, ooh, that's like a big next step.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's been really helping me through that is knowing that I can fight it all I want, but at the end of the day, that has always been my driving force. And so you might as well just surrender into it and know that that's where you're going, because that's what you've always known to be true for you, and
Mm-hmm.
to just walk that path. And then I think the other scenario would be in my new partnership, having it look very different than I always thought it would, but also having what I thought it would look like, and it being so unhealthy and so not what I wanted. And so that contrast has been so beautiful, and has brought in so much light and love for me, and appreciation for contrast, and for the magic that the universe, spirit always has in the pipeline to just
Mm-hmm.
bring forward, and to bring something different than what we thought it would be, and surrendering more and more into that trust also.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about like when we have an idea of how we want things to happen and when the things that happen aren't in alignment with what we want them to look like. It's always interesting to see how you respond in those moments and what you do with what's presented to you.
Yeah, and I think like, when I notice myself, not even myself, when I notice the voice come in and perhaps want to introduce a story, always coming back to the feeling, and
Mhm.
always coming back to the trust, and knowing like, hey, every previous time when you've used your head and logic in this situation, it's never worked out in your favor. But look at how you feel in these situations, and look at the lightness that you have and the love and all of these things, and that is your compass at the end of the day.
Mhm. Yeah. Can you, because you've mentioned your somatic work, can you explain a little bit more about what that is and what it is that you help people do in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So somatic really means dealing directly with the body. And the somatic sexological training table work that I do is kind of like psychosomatic. So it's using the mind and the body. So it's a lot of healing at a cellular level and removing the trauma and energy out of the tissue of the body. So that's the somatic part, and I can go a little bit deeper into that before introducing the psychological piece. But basically, when we experience trauma, and trauma can feel like a really heavy word, so I think that it's just worth kind of going into, like, there's big T traumas and small T traumas, and I think that often when we hear the word traumas, I know for me, like, I grew up in a very normal family. I grew up with a brother and a sister and a mom who was a nurse, and my dad was a fireman, and just like standard typical American family, with a brother who was valedictorian. My sister was a music teacher. So everything on the surface was really normal. And so on my journey, I had so much self-neglect and self-abuse, and whether it be eating disorders or this strive for perfection that led me down all of these dark paths, or abusive relationship that I faced and the repetition of them, I always came back to the question of, like, why am I creating this? What is the lesson in this? Like, I came from this really perfect quote unquote family, and why am I struggling with all of this? And so I think it's just worth recognizing that trauma can be anything, and it can show up in so many different ways. So for me, in my process, I got into this work because it had felt like I had done so much of the personal development growth and so much of the mind work. And I had, at that point, ended an abusive relationship that left me with a lot of sexual trauma in my physical body. And so I had done so much work around that, around my childhood, around all of these things, but I felt still so stuck in my body, and it felt locked up, and I didn't feel free. I felt really detached and like dissociated and unsafe. So that's how I really found this work, was like, okay, I did all of this and it's not fully out of me, and I'm not fully embodied. So, and the other piece of it was really disconnected to my sexuality, feeling a lot of shame, judgment, and unsafety in my own personal expression. So basically, when we go through these traumas, our body takes this energy and creates these like energy buildups, and it gets stored in the tissue of our body. And so it can be stored anywhere in the body. I have a somatic body chart that I love to share. And if you follow me on my social platforms, I'll kind of go into them. Like the right hip, for example, is where a lot of abandonment can be stored. And our stomach is where a lot of family issues and family sexual issues can be stored. And so with the somatic table work, you're really going into the body and allowing the body to bring forward any situations and memories that are unhealed where we've gotten stuck. So with trauma, we have the fight, fright, or freeze response. So when we are in a traumatic situation, we often fight, which is not many of us, especially as women. It's more of the men that are kind of fighting back, which is ideally kind of like I'll say like the best response, because at least you're taking action and you're moving through it. But the other two responses, flying, would be kind of to run and escape, and often that means up and out of our body. So before I had done this work, it had felt like I was always viewing and living my life from outside of my body, almost like a movie screen. I would like walk into a room and see myself come in, but I wasn't living through my own two eyes. And then the other response would be to freeze, where we just lock up, right? And we're like really indecisive. We can't make a decision, and we're just stuck. So with those responses, the energy gets stuck in our body and stuck in our tissue, and creates all of these different points of pain and symptoms and ailments and memories ultimately. So with the table work, you're unwinding those things, letting the body communicate, and really taking you back into the memories that the body surfaces, and rewriting the story. So for example, if you were in a traumatic situation where, let's just say you got like attacked on the street, and you got mugged or something like that, if your body had trauma around that, going into that, kind of really, really taking you back into it and doing whatever you needed in that moment to take your power back, whether that means fighting back or saying the unspoken words to your friend who hurt you, or reliving an experience with your mom or your dad that didn't feel safe. So it can really be anything. And typically it's going to be from the ages of 0 to 7 that things are going to surface and really have the biggest impact on you. So that's the somatic portion. And then the sexological portion is really kind of like, there's so much with trauma. Like I mentioned, it's stored in certain parts of the body. And with sexual trauma, it's stored on those parts of you. And so with the sexological work, it's really allowing you to take back your sexual power. It looks different for men and women. For women, it's a lot of a sexual awakening. It's almost like an initiation process, but so much in the same way that our body stores trauma and memory, so does our yoni as women. And there's so much memory stored in there, and pain points and things like that. So it's a combination of reliving those, which can sound heavy, but it's the most freeing experience you can ever have. But really going back into those memories, allowing yourself to take back your power in those scenarios. And then with pleasure on top, it's a whole nother piece. So it's almost like you're taking the body, doing surgery, right? Like opening up all of these wounds, and then you're taking pleasure and putting it on top, and bringing back the ease, showing you what life really should feel like, bringing back the divinity of who you are, combining your sexuality with spirituality, and remembering that that is sacred, that it is divine. And so many women out there there's so much of a lack of education around sexuality and what our bodies can do, and the sacredness of sexuality. So it's a combination of both of those two things. So it's sexological work and somatic work.
I'm sure you witnessed some incredibly powerful transformations, not just in your own life, but with the clients you work with.
Absolutely. It's been the most rewarding work that I've ever done.
That's amazing. So I'm curious then to know, based on the work you've done in the world, your own healing work, the healing work you're supporting for other people, when it comes to living a life of significance, how would you define that today?
Life of significance. I would say living in alignment with your highest self, feeling fully expressed, free to be fully expressed. And I feel like it looks different for everyone, but really tuning into your authentic self, and connecting with your purpose and your passion, and living those out with so much clarity and embodiment and freedom, I would say. And I think that it can, again, look so different on everyone, which is so exciting. And
Yeah.
and love.
And love. I love it. Yes. So I actually had an idea. So usually as I mentioned earlier, I close by asking people if you could go back to any point in time, past, present, future, and talk to yourself, what would it be that you would want to say to yourself today? And I kind of want to just put a little twist on the question today. And instead of that, ask you if you could sit down with your heart. If you could go into your heart space today and have a conversation with your heart, what would you want to tell your heart today?
What do I want to tell my heart today? I would tell my heart to know that the unknown is safe, and in the unknown is where all the magic is. And in the stretching of yourself, you really get to see yourself and to see who you really are. And even further, that self-trust. Yeah. And to always lead from that place of heart-centeredness.
I love that. I think I'm going to keep asking that question. I really like it. I think it takes us again from like our minds. What do you want to tell yourself? What are you thinking? What are your thoughts, into a different space, into that heart space? And I think we could all use a little bit more time in that space. So
Hell yeah.
Amazing. Well, I would love for you to take a moment to let everyone listening know more about you, how they can find you, where they can find you. If there's anything else you want to share with those listening, please do so.
Thank you so much. So I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is Julianne Vaccaro. So 2 N's and 2 C's, 1 R. Always on my stories, I've been posting a lot more graphics lately, which has felt really cool. And just a lot more education on that platform. I also have a podcast called The Reclamation Project, available on iTunes and Spotify. I have a couple of different program offerings. The approach and methodology that I've created is called the Goddess Approach. So there's Goddess Initiative, which is my 3-month program that really focuses around holistic health and mindset mastery. So a combination of gut health, liver health, hormone health, hormone balancing, intuitive eating, and really healing the relationship that you have with yourself, body, and food to clear the path to then step into Goddess Reclamation, which is a 5-month program where you're really diving into spiritual psychology, somatic, sexological work on your own, learning how to somatically process embodiment practices, learning about your body as a woman, about your sacred sexuality, and also going deeper into your childhood and really reclaiming your power on every area and every layer of who you are. And then the last one is Goddess Embodied, which is the somatic sexological work. And then the retreats are called the Goddess Experience. So I just finished one last weekend, which was here in Denver. And in 2020, I'll be doing ones kind of all over. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Well, I will have all of that goodness linked in the show notes for anyone listening who wants to continue to get more good content from you and see all that you're putting out into the world. Thank you so much, Julianne, for joining me on the podcast. I can't wait to continue seeing all of your authentic expressions through your work and the content you put out, and just have so much gratitude for people out there doing the work you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. And same to you, Tallia.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, that was my conversation with Julianne. Her and I, as I mentioned in the intro, did a podcast swap. So if you want to check out my episode on her podcast, it is linked in the show notes. We talked all about identity. How do we shape our sense of who we are and our sense of worth in the world? We talk about breaking free of self-imposed limitations. We talk about how critical it is for us to get feedback as humans. We talk about fear. We talk about the difference between how men and women construct their sense of identity. We talk about change. We talk about positive psychology, a lot of good stuff there too. So be sure to check out her podcast. And as a fellow podcast host, both of us would absolutely love for you to subscribe, rate, review, share some love with us. Let us know what you thought about our conversations and say hello. You can find me on Instagram at Tallia Deljoux, and more about me and how we can work together on my website at talliadeljoux.com. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will catch you on the next episode. Sincerely, me.